All right, folks, it's a pleasure to welcome Professor Tommi Jaakkola. Tommi is, he got his bachelor's degree in theoretical physics, if I'm not wrong. He is in the long tradition of many theoretical physicists who have made a transition into machine learning, or in particular into speech and language, and done some great work. After his theoretical physics bachelor's, I think you got a doctorate in neuroscience from MIT? Computational neuroscience from MIT, where he's now a professor. And he came to our attention a few years ago through our association with Gert Kallenbergs. I think Gert was in your lab for a sabbatical or something like that. And yeah, that's right, as a fellow. And then so he came and visited us a couple of years ago, and we were impressed with his talk, and we wanted him to come back and tell us what he's doing today. His interests are very varied: machine learning mainly, statistical estimation, and lately he's been doing some work in computational biology, I hear. So he'll tell us about elements of inference.
Thanks. This is a particular slice of the work that I've been pursuing, and I don't actually know the composition of the audience that well, so I'd appreciate it if you ask questions when you don't understand something, so I can adjust the level a little bit. I try to sort of give this talk a little bit on a couple of levels so that everybody gets something, hopefully. So let's see how that goes. So I'm going to present an optimization view of inference, how to make use of models effectively. And I'm going to start by sort of motivating why I am particularly interested in sort of the more theoretically oriented work in this context. So basically, everything we do is modeling in sciences or engineering, and we're trying to capture sort of complex phenomena, and the more complex the phenomena, the more complex the models become. So it's easy to find complexity in biology. You have thousands of molecular interactions, and they are used in a sort of on-demand fashion, and to understand those, you need to create complex models. Sometimes the complexity is intentional or required, as in communication. You want to tie together the bits that you're sending over an uncertain channel to be able to decode the message effectively, and so forth. Regardless of the context, we are in the setting that we have a complex model, and we are limited by how effectively we can make use of those models, whether to estimate them from the data or just to make predictions. Okay, so let me give you a couple of very specific examples just to highlight how that complexity arises in the context that I'm interested in solving, sort of the applied context. So if you look at just transcriptional regulation or genetic control, or control of how genes are turned on and off, that's a very complicated system. You have a huge number of possible molecular interactions. If you activate a receptor, then there's a molecular cascades that take place. They diverge, and ultimately there may be proteins that bind at a particular location at the DNA, and that will cause a particular gene to be transcribed, turned on or off if the molecule is a repressor. Okay, so there's a lot of complexity, and we cannot possibly understand it all at once. So let's take a little bit simpler perspective and try to understand just what are the interactions that are present actually in that system, and how they might be used in simple ways. And once we have some understanding of that, we also need to look at exactly where that protein binds along the DNA, not just roughly sort of overall in this region. In order to understand how the genes are regulated, we need to pinpoint that exactly. Okay, so let's just see how we might build a model in this context. So take a particular interaction, protein DNA or protein-protein, and specify a variable that says whether that interaction exists or not. Okay, very simple. As you set those variables, you get, in this case, a labeled graph as a result. So setting up the variables gives you a graph. Okay, so you're trying to derive from data that you have probability distribution over such graphs. Okay, everything would be simple if you had data pertaining to individual variables. Okay? Because the problem would decouple into individual problems of estimating each of these interactions. Okay? That's not the case. Typically, the data couples the variables in very strong ways. Array measurements that we have for judging protein-protein and other interaction measures have failure modes that sort of affect a large number of the variables here, or a large number of possible interactions. If you look at, say, genes and look at how they temporally in the cell, as cell evolves, how they may be turned on and off in a correlated fashion, you would want to explain that correlation somehow using the model that you're constructing. And that correlation implies a sort of an underlying common correlate. And in the graph theory terms here, you would want to find a common ancestor. Okay? So now that common ancestor is a set of paths in the graph, and all the interactions along that along those paths would have to be present in order for you to use that molecule as an explanation for correlation that you might observe. Okay? So you get this large coupling of larger and larger collections of variables, and to actually then infer something about such a model, you need to do it approximately. Okay? So even if you were able to solve that problem, but you cannot, except approximately, the similar type of coupling happens even on the very low level of deciding where a particular protein binds along the DNA. So take a particular protein, and we measure along the DNA at some sparse locations where it might bind. Okay? We get signal at some sparse locations. So suppose this is a representation of a DNA. Okay? The experiments are typically done in triplicate, so you get 3 measurements at each of these locations. Okay? So this is the measurement, but what you would actually like to infer is a much sharper base-by-base resolution location for where that binding actually occurred. Okay? And even in this context, we get that large coupling of variables. So let's see how that comes about. So how do you actually measure this? So you have that red dot there that represents a protein bound to a DNA, and then you fragment the DNA. So some fragments are bound with the protein, others are not, and you enrich the portion that's bound with the protein. Okay? So if now you measure at sparse locations where at each probe you have a complementary sequence to a fragment that you're trying to capture. Okay? So the longer the fragment in this shearing process, the further away from the actual site you measure some signal. Okay? So now, based on that physical model, you can estimate sort of the expected signal that you would get at these sparse locations based on having a binding at a very specific location. Okay? Well, now, when you actually get measurements, there are multiple sites that are trying to compete to explain the actual noisy observations. And that competition or configuration of binding events creates this large coupling of variables that you would like to resolve. And that's almost inevitable in terms of the physical characterization of this model. Okay? Another example that's perhaps closer to some here is just a simple coding problem. You have on top here bits that you wish to send through an uncertain channel. You couple them with priority checks so that you send this correlated set of bits so that when you actually get noisy versions of those bits that you send, you can use these parity checks to try to infer what the actual code word was. Okay? In this case, you have intentionally a large, complicated coupling between the bits that you send. Okay? And the decoding problem, finding the bits that you send, is a hard inference problem that you can only solve approximately. Okay? So there is a large class of problems where the complexity is inevitable, and we would like to develop methods that can solve the problem approximately in somehow controlled fashion. Okay, so let's take a very concrete example just to develop the methods or illustrate the methods that I'm going to talk about so that the problem is very clear. So think of this building, or one floor of the building, and each node here represents a room, and there's a temperature gauge at each room. And for simplicity, let's say it only measures whether it's hot or cold in that room. Okay? Adjacent rooms are coupled, so their temperature gauges, no matter how you set the temperatures, they are in some manner coupled. So you get this layout graph structure for the floor with coupled variables that denote the temperatures in each room. Okay? So the model here is based on those local couplings that, for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to assume that we know what those couplings are, but the algorithms that I'm going to talk about are also needed for figuring out what those couplings should be. Okay? But let's assume that part of the problem has been solved just for illustration purposes. Okay? So when you look at now configurations of possible temperatures, meaning the setting of each variables in this model, each setting of each variable at the nodes, you get a probability model over those configurations by just taking a product of these local couplings. Okay? So if you're a physicist, this would be like a spin class model in terms of the hot-cold temperature assignments. Okay? And the normalization constant here is called partition function that plays a very crucial role in actually understanding how to make effective use of these models. Okay? So what do I mean by an inference task? You actually make a measurement here, and you try to infer how, or you set the temperatures here, and you would like to infer what would happen in a particular part of the flow. Okay? And use those couplings to understand that. In order to solve that problem, we have to entertain the possible configurations of these variables, essentially sum over them, in order to understand how sort of the influence propagates from these variables to the variable that I'm actually interested in solving. Okay? Okay, so everything would be simple if the room layout looked like a tree. Okay? So you would have here hot, cold, and there would be a single path, unique path of influence between any two variables in the model. Okay? So why is that important? Well, look at it from the point of view of this variable. If it receives influence from here or here, it knows for certain that those evidence coming from disparate parts of the model are actually independent. So it is easy to integrate that evidence locally. Okay? And that, for that, it is absolutely crucial that there's a unique path of influence between the variables. So if we have a tree, everything is simple, but that's not typically the case, and there are multiple paths of influence between any two variables in the model. Okay? And looking again from the point of view of this variable here, it can no longer locally infer that these pieces of evidence were independent. It would typically double count the same evidence multiple times and get a erroneous answer. Okay? So the problem in this case is no longer local. You cannot use the single path of influence to locally propagate the effect. You have to entertain more globally these configurations of variables. Okay? So that is the setting that I'm going to talk about here, how to solve that inference problem. And first got how to frame that problem. Okay? And I'm going to argue that solving that problem actually combines problems of very different types. And all of them are relevant for solving this problem. Okay? So what is the counting problem? Counting problem is to entertain the different possible configurations of variables. summing over weighted configurations of variables where they are weighted by those local couplings that I introduced earlier. Okay? So that's one type of problem, counting problem. Another problem is a geometrical one. What is the set of valid marginal probabilities, so probabilities over locally defined groups of variables? What's a valid setting of those marginal probabilities? Okay, that seems like a problem that is simple to solve, but that is actually one of the hardest parts of the inference task. Okay, I'll mention that, I'll introduce that in a little bit more detail in just a little bit. Last problem, last part of this three-way outline is uncertainty. If I give you a set of marginal probabilities, so think of somebody measuring how, over time, locally, how this temperature here covaries with that. And you do that for all adjacent rooms. You have a long vector of these marginal probabilities. Then the question is, what is the entropy of the distribution from which these samples came from? That, again, is a hard problem to solve. Okay? So an example of the counting problem is just computing the normalization constant, partition function for the model that we defined previously. You sum over all the possible settings of the variables weighted by how favorable they are in terms of these local couplings. And if you could solve this problem, you could solve the inference problem. Okay? Now, the problem of geometry. So think of just having these local marginal probabilities between adjacent rooms, concatenate all of them into a vector that defines a point in space. Okay? And then the question is, what is the space that they can vary? That space that they can vary is known as the marginal polytope. Okay? It is a polytope. It is constrained by linear constraints, but it is an extremely complicated one. Okay? It is, in fact, a hard problem to say. If you give me a point here, it is a hard problem to say whether it is inside or outside this marginal polytope. Okay? Put another way, think of, again, over time measuring marginal probabilities, sort of how temperatures covary across adjacent rooms. Okay? Clearly, those came from some valid distribution, so they should be inside, that vector should be inside the marginal polytope. Okay? But now give it to the adversary, and it can tweak those probabilities a little bit, give them back to you, and the question is, could you tell whether the resulting point is now something that could have come from measurements? Okay? And the answer is that, in general, you cannot. And sort of the hardness of inference can often be traced back precisely to the hardness of the problem of characterizing the marginal polytope. Okay? The last part of this puzzle is characterizing uncertainty. Here, mu is now that vector of marginal probabilities, how different coupled or adjacent rooms, how their temperatures covary. Then the question is, you give me a vector, can I tell you what that entropy is? And in general, I cannot. Okay? So to put these together, you get an equation that couples the counting problem with the geometry problem and the problem of characterizing the entropy. Okay? If you're a physicist, this is an equation that relates free energy with entropy, with energy and entropy. Okay? If you're an optimization person, this would be known as a Legendre transform of convex functions. If you're a statistician, it looks like a convex duality associated with exponential formula of distributions. Okay? If you're an information theorist, then this would be an instance of an information projection, just represented it in terms of the marginals. Okay? So we can say that the log partition function, that counting problem, result of that counting problem, is now a maximization problem over valid probabilities, probabilities that are actually marginal probability vectors that are actually inside this marginal polytope. And that maximization is done in order to maximize the entropy and tie the result appropriately with how the room temperatures were coupled across the rooms. Okay? So if you could solve this problem, then you could solve inference problems in general. So something has to break down, and I've already sort of hinted at what breaks down. Representing the marginal polytope typically is hard, and it is provably hard in general. And entropy is difficult to evaluate. Okay? So all the critical pieces of this puzzle are actually hard to do. So by just representing these three aspects of the problem in this manner, we didn't solve anything, we just transformed the problem into a different form. Okay? So I mentioned earlier that everything would be easy if the model was a tree. Okay? That easiness should somehow be evident in this formulation as well. So it should be the case that the marginal polytope for trees is easy to characterize. It should be the case that I can evaluate the entropy for trees in somehow easy way. Okay? So let's see how that comes about. So let's look at those marginal probabilities between adjacent rooms in this model. And just write down simple constraints that any valid marginal probabilities would have to satisfy. Okay? You have two marginals that tell something about the common variable, then clearly they have to be consistent about that common variable. Okay? Any marginal probability, valid or not, has to satisfy that. Otherwise, we would immediately be able to rule them out. Okay? If your marginal probability vector, so that concatenation of these marginal probabilities, satisfies these consistency constraints, it's known to belong in something called local marginal polytope. Local because it's characterized by linear constraints that result, linear constraints, as you see, by these consistency conditions. And nicely, for trees, that suffices. If the model is tree structured, then only thing you need to ensure is that their marginal probabilities are locally consistent. If they are, then they are valid probabilities in terms of the marginal polytope for that model. Okay, so far so good. Okay, what about?
So what you're saying is, if you back up one slide,
yeah.
What you're saying is that in this case, it is possible to have, let's say, 4 marginals on that square, which are all pairwise consistent, but which all 4 together aren't consistent.
That's
and
right.
That's why local G is a superset of MG.
Exactly.
And MG is a subset of that. Okay.
That's right. So we would have in that marginal, that point here would include marginals over this, and over that. But it's not sufficient just to say that they are locally consistent. If you say that, then some of those points would be outside the marginal polytope, some would be inside. This is a superset of all valid marginal probabilities would be inside this, but not necessarily covering the whole space. Okay? So we can characterize the marginal polytope easily for trees. We can also evaluate the entropy easily for trees. So any entropy function by the chain rule of entropies, you can write down as a variable given all the rest. Okay? Take that variable out, then another variable given the remaining rest, and so forth. That's a chain rule of entropies, and regardless of the distribution, you can always write entropy in this way. Okay? So let's see what happens for trees. If you look at this variable here, well, that variable only depends on one other variable. Okay? So all these dependencies here that I introduced were unnecessary. I only need to retain one, where that dependence actually appears in the model. Okay? So I can cross out those. Now I can move to a different variable, do the same. X4 here only depends on X2, so some of those conditioning variables I can drop out, and so forth. You get the idea. Okay? So now I get a decomposition of entropy for trees very easily by just dropping the conditionings based on what do not appear in the model. Okay? And the nice thing about this decomposition is that if you look at the actual entropy terms, they are only terms that involve pairs of variables that correspond to the marginals that I'm actually representing in that concatenated marginal vector. So if I'm given the marginal vector, I can actually evaluate this function very easily. Okay?
So in that equation you had log z equals whatever. So the entropy can be computed by only knowing all the marginal mu's. You don't need to know and it is the entropy of the joint distribution, even
That's
though
right.
only the marginals entered the calculation.
Exactly.
Okay.
So I can collapse the whole representation just to looking at these marginal probabilities.
So you're looking in local G.
That's right. Okay. So here's the equation. So now the entropy is function of these local marginal probabilities. We know how to compute that. We have a very simple characterization of the marginal polytope for trees. So we can optimize over that easily. So we can actually solve this optimization problem, solve the counting problem. Okay? But that required us having a tree. So more generally, the marginal polytope is hard to characterize. Exponentially many linear constraints that characterize that polytope, and we cannot really evaluate the entropy function. Okay? But we can try to approximate both in somehow controlled fashion to solve the counting problem in a controlled fashion. Okay? So how could we do that? Well, let's see what we can do with, say, entropy. Okay? So tree squares are nice. Let's pretend that the model that we have is actually a tree. Okay? Let's take part of the model indicated by those red arrows that actually is a tree. It's a spanning tree, so it includes all the nodes, but not all the edges in the model. Okay? So now I can say that the entropy corresponding to these marginals is just given by the entropy that I would get corresponding to that tree. Okay? So what happens is that I'm dropping conditioning variables where I shouldn't. And I increase entropy as a result. Okay? But I get a term that I can easily evaluate again. It's an upper bound on the entropy of the tree model. Okay? Well, the different types of trees that I can peg. Large number of possible spanning trees that I can peg. And now I can drop the conditioning variables in different way by looking at a different tree. And I get a slightly different decomposition of the entropy. That's, again, an upper bound on the true entropy that I would like to have. Okay? Well, if I have 2 or more ways to do it, I can average them. I still have an upper bound on the entropy that I'm interested in computing. And you can collapse this average over all possible spanning trees by using a variant of matrix tree theorem. That's a way of counting over spanning trees in the graph. Question?
Can you get a bare bound by picking a minimum?
Right, so let's put it this way. Define a distribution over trees, okay? And now, so what this decomposition means is that I have an average that for each variable, I have a distribution over the possible number of times that I picked a particular conditioning variable, okay? Now, I have parameterized my upper bound on the entropy, right? Because I had a different weighting of these spanning trees, and I can choose one weighting over another, and I get a different bound as a result. Okay? So now I can optimize over these possible weights. Sort of the population of spanning trees that I'm using, I can optimize these weights to make a better bound on the entropy.
So
and the minimum is actually in the set of things that you're optimizing over, right?
Correct.
Because it just puts all the. I mean, you haven't described how you parameterize the mixture weights. Obviously, you're not going to have an exponential number of them, but presumably.
These are just the weights that you would get. For each node, you have a distribution over other neighbors.
Exactly.
In terms of the number of times that in my population of spanning trees, I picked a particular neighbor as a conditioning.
Yes, so you're able to use the matrix tree theorem as a result.
That's right. So I can use a matrix tree theorem to get these collapse that distribution to distribution of those local weights.
So picking up on Vaslav's question, what's the advantage to choosing the minimum by optimizing over this variationally described set rather than simply picking the minimum? Since minimum spanning tree is...
right. The problem with that is that the minimum depends on mu. So the minute I change mu, the minimum changes.
Thanks.
Okay. So I actually want a distribution that sort of is in the support set of the minimum.
That's fine. And this is very closely related to work by Martin Wainwright, is that right?
Yes, this is an extension of that work, but it is closely related to that. Yes.
Yeah,
okay. Okay, so what happens in terms of the problem that I'm trying to solve? Here's the original problem, optimizing over the marginal polytope with the true entropy. Now I replace that with an upper bound, and I get an upper bound on the log partition function, the counting problem that I set out to solve. Okay? So that's for looking at the entropy approximation. So what about the marginal polytope? Well, we already talked about this. The simplest possible thing to do is to say, well, I can't characterize the marginal polytope exactly, but I can easily get an outer bound. I can easily sort of define the set that contains the set of valid marginals, and that's exactly that local marginal polytope. Since all valid marginal probabilities have to be locally consistent, then that set of locally consistent marginal probabilities contains the marginal polytope of interest. Okay? So the simplest thing is just to say, well, I'm going to optimize over this larger set rather than restricting to that hard to characterize set. So here's the upper bound that we got by replacing entropy with an upper bound. Now we get another upper bound by extending the optimization over a larger set of marginals. Okay? So the advantage is that now at least we have a bound on the counting problem, and the bound is something that we can evaluate and compute and optimize over. Okay? So let's put other methods in context in this sense. So here's the quantity that I would really want to optimize, the energy plus entropy term called variational free energy. And if I optimize that over the true marginal polytope, which is this segment here, then I would get the true answer for the counting problem. Okay? So the method that I described here, and there have been other methods related, that generate an upper bound on the entropy. Okay? So you get an upper bound on the variational free energy that you're optimizing, and you're optimizing it over a larger set, so you get an answer somewhere here. Okay? Now, some of you may be familiar with mean field methods, and we can understand them also in this sense. Now, you restrict the class of distributions that you're using to model the distribution of interest, and you restrict it so much that you can actually evaluate the entropy exactly for those distributions. So you are optimizing over a very narrow segment inside the marginal polytope, but you have an exact representation of the variational free energy corresponding to those. Okay? The problem with such methods is that even though in this 1D picture this looks like a convex set, typically that set is not a convex set that you're optimizing over. Okay? Now, in terms of, so I've so far talked about the objectives, what I should optimize. So what about the algorithms actually used for optimizing this? Well, the typical way of optimizing methods like loopy belief propagation exploit the fact that we try to ensure local consistency of these marginals. Okay? So you can take a variable and try to ensure local consistency by passing messages between the variables and do that for all variables. And such algorithms have as their convergence points, if they converge, stationary points of the types of objectives that we talked about. Okay? And there's quite a bit of work on actually trying to understand when they do and don't converge. Okay? But if you have an objective already, particularly if it's a sort of controlled objective, a bound of some kind, then you can get a distributed algorithm much more easily. You can just take a local part of that objective, and these objectives retain locality. So things that are close to each other in the original model, they are close to each other in terms of dependence in the objective, the upper bound that you're looking at. Okay? So you can take one piece, it depends on a certain set of marginals, and optimize that and move around. You get a distributed algorithm that's guaranteed monotonically to optimize your objective. The downside of that is that this type of local optimization problem is typically a constrained optimization problem because you have these consistency constraints, so you have to take those into account. But in many cases, you can get the dual of that and get a local objective that's unconstrained. Okay, so there are ways of dealing with that downside as well. Okay, so how do we go beyond that? Beyond trees and beyond that simple local marginal polytope approximation, just to solve this problem in a better way. Okay, well, we don't have to trap the conditioning only to get a tree. Okay, I could define now sets of variables over this model and say that for this variable, I'm going to make the conditioning only based on other variables within one of these sets. So I can take this, drop everything else except these three, then that's gone. Look at this variable. Now I can take as conditioning set either these because they are part of this set, or these because they are part of another set. And get a different, sort of a higher order conditional entropy decomposition that's guaranteed to give me a better approximation, a better upper bound in terms of the true entropy. Okay? Well, what about the marginals? Well, you can do the same in terms of marginals, define them over larger collections of variables, and make them agree locally. Now you have a local marginal polytope, but over larger groups of variables, that's guaranteed to be much tighter than the marginal polytope over just pairwise agreements. But this type of approach, that's actually a typical approach, is very wasteful. And why is it wasteful? Because this is an attempt to capture the full marginal polytope. Okay? We know it's complex, but we only need a very small part of that marginal polytope to characterize accurately, the one where the solution lies. Okay? So maybe there's a way of adaptively characterize the marginal polytope only where the solution lies. And here's a particular methodology for doing that. So borrowing...
Sorry, before you move on to this,
yeah.
I'd like to understand the relation between the previous two slides.
Okay.
So I had a... let's see. So when you're averaging over possible elimination orders, I'm torn between saying, well, once you pick an elimination order, then you're in junction tree land, and it looks a lot like the next slide. Because when you eliminate, you have to merge variables, which is what you seem to be saying on the next slide is different from this slide. The other possibility is that you've got an elimination order, but you're making approximations as you eliminate, so you're cutting, but then it seems to be similar to averaging over. Then an elimination order basically gives you a tree, if I'm not mistaken. By
no,
getting
it
rid
is
of
not.
backlinks.
So eliminate, just to say
No, I'm
elimination
sorry, no,
order,
I'm sorry, get rid of that.
I can
Yeah.
do that for exactly for any model and just marginalize over variables one after another. I get an elimination order and I solve the problem exactly. The problem is that
But you can't solve it exactly for a given elimination order, right? Because individual terms here haven't been approximated to the point where they become
So
practical.
here, this does not solve it exactly, but it expands the range. It expands sort of how much of that dependence in those marginal distributions that I would get by following a particular elimination order, how much of that dependence I capture in terms of the entropy.
Okay, now maybe I understand where you are in the talk. So this slide is not intended to be a method by itself. You're just laying the ground for the next 2 or possibly more slides.
Right, so this is a particular way of doing entropy, approximating just the entropy.
Okay.
Okay.
So given a particular elimination order, the next slide says that you're going to do, you're actually going to apply variable elimination according to that elimination order, but it's wasteful to do that. So you're going to go.
Not variable elimination. Everything is an optimization problem here.
Yeah.
So you don't actually solve, and this doesn't define a junction tree. There are loops of these sets.
Yes.
If I define a junction tree, I would solve the problem exactly.
Yes.
Okay? I can't do that.
Indeed.
It would be too complex. So I'm just defining a smaller, higher order structure and capturing more of the dependencies in terms of entropy, and this is one way to do that, and I can get a very similar approximation that's locally defined as we had previously for trees. It's just a next step away from simple trees.
But so you're saying that the H-bar approximation is now tighter,
Yes.
but then the set of valid marginals is now more complex because they are valid marginals of tuples, not just pairs.
Exactly.
And that's what you're saying. It's wasteful in the sense verifying that their consistency is more work now.
So that's always true. I define marginals over larger groups of variables, tuples, as you said.
Right.
Then even representing them, it's exponential in the number of variables in the set.
Correct.
And I now have to verify them over more
Yeah.
component variables and so forth.
Yeah.
Okay? So I essentially could do that,
Okay.
and then all the terms here would be nicely defined within the same sets, and if I have those marginals, I can evaluate all the terms in the entropy. Okay? The argument is that doing this is wasteful because it is an attempt to approximate the marginal polytope everywhere.
Right.
Okay? And I'm only interested in a single point somewhere in the marginal polytope. So why not focus the approximation around that point? Okay?
So the idea would be far away from the optimum, you're happy with just pairwise tree-like marginals, and as you get closer, you're going to have larger and larger order marginals.
Yes,
okay,
though it's not
tell us.
as sort of a locally, it's not defined locally in this representation. It's locally in that marginal polytope. Okay, so how could I get a method that tries to generate a better approximation just sort of where I need it to be good? It is a polytope. A marginal polytope is a polytope, so it's defined by linear constraints. So maybe there's a set of linear constraints that I can iteratively add to refine the approximation if I see that it is actually outside the marginal polytope. The point that I would optimize with simple pairwise marginal constraints, I would get a point that's outside the marginal polytope. If I add a linear constraint that cuts off that solution, I get a slightly better solution. And I can do that iteratively. Okay? And the hope is that I need very few linear constraints in comparison to characterize the marginal polytope around the true solution. Okay?
So pictorially speaking, the outer octagon is the local sort
Right,
of
that's the starting point,
starting
say.
point. And instead of drawing these cutting planes all around to get that square in the middle, you're only going to draw them near where your current iterate is.
That's right. So think of that point there as what I got if I used the local marginal polytope. I solved the optimization problem. Right. That is the point that I got.
Right.
But then I found, well, that's outside the marginal polytope. So I get a better solution if I force it to be a little bit closer to the marginal polytope. So I introduce a constraint that separates that point from the true marginal polytope. Okay? That separation task in general is actually a hard problem.
I was going to say, you have to identify the higher order marginals which are not satisfied by your solution.
Right. So in general,
and then impose those. Yeah.
That's right. In general, I cannot solve that problem. It's provably hard. Okay? But I can still look at a set of linear inequalities that I'm willing to entertain, that are efficient to find, and use those to try to see if they are violated. I will add them as linear constraints and proceed.
Yeah. Now, every time you do that, you need a more complex description of the set that you're considering, right?
Right. I'm adding linear constraints, so my polytope gets more and more complex, but in a very localized fashion. And it's not the exponential many constraints that I would otherwise
Of course.
try to capture. Okay? So then the question is there an efficient class of linear inequalities that I can find that are somehow more powerful than the local consistency constraints here? And yes, there are such things called, for example, there are different classes. A particular class is called cycle inequalities. So let me try to capture the idea. So think of this as a model with binary variables, as we've been talking about for simplicity. And think of a cut in the graph as a way of separating variables that are set to 1 from those that are set to -1. Okay? So the edges that separate those variables are called the cut. Okay? So take any cycle in that graph. Okay? Along that cycle, any real cut would have an even number of crossings with that cycle. Okay? Why? Because wherever you start, you have to return to the same assignment. So there's an even number of times you can switch the assignment as you are moving along that cycle. Okay? So how does that help you? Well, based on that property, we can define an inequality. If you give me a set of marginal probabilities, like this, then I can see that if I introduced a cut in an odd number of places, then if they were real marginal probabilities, then something would have to happen. Okay? Either one of those things that I introduced as not having a cut would actually have to have a cut, or one of the cuts that I used would actually have to be variables equal. Okay? One of those two things have to happen if the marginal probabilities are valid. Okay? So this probability has to be greater than 1. And that's the inequality. Okay? You give me a marginal vector, valid or not, I can verify for any odd number of cuts that I specify whether this inequality is satisfied. Okay? And so now it's a problem of optimizing over all cycles and all odd number of cuts in that cycle and try to minimize this side in terms of a specific marginal vector. Okay? And if that minimum is less than 1, I know one cycle inequality is violated, and I can introduce that as a constraint and then go on. Okay? But how I defined it is completely infeasible to do, but there is a very fast way of casting that optimization problem as a shortest path problem in a slightly different graph. Okay? So very quickly, you duplicate the model. You generate a copy of the model. Okay? And for each edge, you connect the variable and its duplicate or its corresponding pair in a crosswise fashion. Okay? And you set the weights on these edges in such a way that any path from variable to its copy corresponds to an equation of that form. Okay? And if you notice in this model, in order to get from one variable to its copy, I can only do an odd number of these cross edges. That's the odd number f that I have to choose, odd number of cuts. Okay? So the problem is reduced to just looking at a variable, find the shortest path. Okay? That will give me the minimum of the left-hand side. And I can do that individually for each variable. And that's it. If one of those is violated, I found the violated cycle inequality. So it is efficient to find these. So there are such inequalities that I can add, and it is efficient to find them. And then the question is, do they work at all? Are they sufficiently powerful to actually get the job done? And they sure seem to be. So this is just demonstration in terms of the model that we've been talking about, binary valued variables, and you vary the coupling, different types of models, and you look at, in comparison, for particular approximations to the entropy, how close in terms of accuracy I get with these adding these linear constraints compared to actually solving the marginal polytope exactly.
Which you can do because you're only doing this on small problems.
Right. So this is just a demonstration, and this is doing the marginal polytope exactly, optimizing over that exactly. So whatever gap here is due to that entropy approximation.
Is the x-axis the number of nodes?
X-axis is the coupling strength in the model.
Oh, I see. And how many nodes are you looking at?
This is, I think, 10.
Everything on 10 nodes?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. And so in this case,
Sorry, 10 nodes in some kind of grid. What's that?
fully connected.
Fully connected. Oh, I see.
It's the same, you get the same picture if this is a 10 by 10 grid or 10 click or something like that.
Yeah,
so
okay.
the results actually don't change in that regard.
Although you mentioned before that for planar graphs, these methods might be exact.
It may have been written on the slide, I did not mention that, yes, cycle inequalities are sufficient for a planar graph of a very particular type to get the marginal polytope exactly.
I see. So
No
10 by 10
external
grid
field, and the coupling is only in terms of agreement. If that's the model, then cycle inequalities would be sufficient to characterize the marginal polytope exactly.
So that should be true for these experiments on a 10 by 10 grid, is that
No,
right? No,
because of
what was
the external field. So if you think of external field, so the sort of biases that you insert on the individual variables, that distorts the picture.
I see. Okay, thanks.
So there's an equivalent formulation of that graph in terms of agreements, and that would have that single external field variable connected to all the other nodes, and that's
so
no longer
And then
planar.
it's no longer planar.
Yeah.
Yep, okay.
Okay? So essentially you get as good solution as you would with using the full marginal polytope by just iteratively adding these constraints.
So I'm just thinking, if you back up a couple of slides, these additional, forward. Yeah, so these are linear inequality constraints. Well, they're not quite, okay, they're constraints on the marginals. What I'm thinking is, how many of these are there? Could this become part of the original set of constraints, and then you would...
Could I explicitly introduce these as marginal constraints?
Right.
I could. So cycle inequalities correspond to triplet constraints on the variables, but not triplets that are local in the graph.
Right.
So take all the variables, all possible triplets. I would have to introduce all those marginals in my marginal vector as well.
Okay, there are now new marginals besides the...
Right, so there would be a marginal between this, that, and that.
Okay.
And I would have to make that consistent with all the others. If I did that, I would get the same power as from cycle inequalities.
Okay.
So the advantage here is that these inequalities are local in the graph.
Okay.
And efficiently computed.
Sorry, and did I understand your answer right, that the cycle inequalities are no more powerful than local triples?
Not local.
Non-local.
All triplets.
All triples, okay.
Right.
Yes, okay, that makes sense.
Okay.
Because you could certainly connect any triple on a cycle.
Yes. Okay. So in terms of at least the simple cases, everything works out well in terms of binary variables. But then the question is, does this work at all in models that have multiple values each variable takes? So that's the typical models that we would have. Is there a way to extend this to those as well? And the answer is yes. And it is simple answer is just cluster the values of the variables. Okay, and look at the membership in the cluster as now a binary model. Okay, so you cast the model into a clustered model. You have a set of marginals over the original model. You cluster the values of the variables. You get a binary model. It has now the same type of marginals that we talked about previously. You can find the cycle bi-related cycle inequality there and bring it back as a constraint on the original model. Okay, so by projection you can get this. And you can also then cast the model in terms of multiple different clusterings, extend the nodes in terms of multiple different clusterings, and optimize over those jointly. So you get a little bit more powerful set of constraints that way. Okay? So then the question again is, do these work in now real problems? So a particular real problem that has the property that the variables take a large number of possible values is something called protein side chain placement problem. So you have a backbone of a protein, and you have certain amino acids, but you can rotate them in various ways, and the energy of the overall energy depends on those rotations. Okay? So now you can try to solve that problem, find the optimal placement with these adding cutting plane constraints, and see if you can get the optimal answer. And with very few iterations of adding these constraints, you get the minimum energy solution. Okay? So these cutting plane constraints seem to help also in the case of models with a large number of possible values. Okay, so essentially I've advocated sort of understanding the inference problem in three different ways: counting problem, geometry, and approximating the entropy. And there are various ways that we already discussed of dealing with these, and particularly the cutting plane approach seems particularly effective. So if in a few minutes I'd like to outline some open problems in this context that the algorithms currently do not handle. So one discrepancy is that if you look at any model of a realistic problem, it typically has multi-scale structure. Okay, planning has multi-scale structure. You look at time course signals, they have multi-scale structure, and so forth. But the algorithms essentially run on the most detailed level of the model. They don't automatically try to identify that multi-scale structure. And that's a major missing piece of these algorithms. There's also a little bit of a convergence between people who are interested in probabilistic inference and those who are interested in network codes, because the operations that you have in a network coding problem resemble those that you would have in a probabilistic inference context. So if you don't know what a network coding problem is, you have a single sender. Say you want to multicast a signal to multiple recipients, but you have to multicast that over a network. Then the question is, what should the intermediate nodes do in terms of this signal so that you get a given rate receiving that same signal at the recipient? Okay? So now you might have a time-dependent code that a particular node has to follow, and a time-dependent code that's trying to mediate the information from the sender to the receiver is very similar to message passing algorithm operating on a graphical model, and what it should do in order to properly account for the evidence that it is trying to communicate. Okay? Another problem is that in sort of a context where we have a large amount of data, for example, Google has this problem. that it has to run whatever models it trains, it has to run them very fast at testing time. Okay? So that changes the problem of how we should model, because we only have certain number of amount of computational resource to spend on any particular test example. Okay? How should we train the models? We shouldn't train them in the typical criterion, because that's optimized for having complete inference access to a lot of computational resources. So this balance of shallow processing at testing time and how it influences the models that we should specify and how we should estimate them is opening as a new area. One area that I'm personally advocating is putting more interesting models as part of the overall probabilistic inference framework, which is, for example, little economic models. If you're trying to understand, say, the energy problem, how little changes in power supply in one context influences the whole system, you have to understand the local economic structures. Okay? But there's a lot of uncertainty in that problem. So how to integrate those economic models that are typically otherwise rather brittle and put them in a framework of probabilistic inference, that is a question that I'm personally very interested in. And there are certainly lots of other open questions in this context. Any questions?
So if you could go back just a couple of slides to, yes, the shallow inference modeling. I'm curious what thoughts you might have there. The problem reminds me of some work that was done in Hal Deme's thesis on trying to learn under conditions of local storage. So basically reinforcement learning kinds of questions. And my guess is that the approaches you have in mind here are different. There's something like, well, we want to learn the variational approximation that does the best, because that's the one that we're going to be using at decoding time. But maybe you have something completely different in mind.
Right. So the first cut approach is just to relate. Say, let's keep the model as it is. We believe in the model. Let's keep it as it is. Then we know that we can only run a very quick approximate inference algorithm at testing time.
Yes.
Okay. So how should we train the model? Should we train it with running the same shallow inference at training time a little bit more, so that the model can sort of figure out the relationships a little bit better, but we cannot go all the way. So characterizing these sort of how much more inference to allocate at training time compared to testing is a sort of a theoretical question that I'm interested in answering. My first cut solution is that there should be some correspondence between training and testing. So if you do shallow inference at testing, you should do shallow inference at training. But that's not the complete story.
And it may not even be optimal, right? So it's not. It doesn't seem obvious.
You're really
that
defining the function that you're optimizing, the predictor that you're using. You're using a predictor that you're defining a new class of models based on how you can use those models. Okay? So the definition of a model is no longer sort of the typical one, because I can't use all those aspects either training or testing.
Right, but it seems important that, I mean, you don't just want to replace the model by an approximate model, because there are some variables that are latent at training time, and your more sophisticated model, which you're able to use at training time, is able to do a better job of reconstructing those latent variables.
More sophisticated inference algorithm, you mean? The model is the same.
Well, yes, let's say more sophisticated inference algorithm. I mean, one way of thinking about certain kinds of approximations is that what they're doing is simplifying the model.
Right.
But But
Yeah,
let's say more complex inference.
you can take draw an analogy to search. So I want to train a model so that things that I need to find are within the depth of search that I'm willing to do at testing time.
For example.
Right. But now there's also another aspect of this problem, which is how should we specify the models to begin with? We should effectively make them richer, but in a way that's more exploitable through shallow inference, so that the combination is, in terms of computational resources, is more optimized to the problem. So it changes also the models that we should be using in this calculus.
Yeah, well, I'm very sympathetic to it.
Okay. Anything else? Okay.
Thank you very much.